Good afternoon. My name is Richard Gabbert, and I'm the Chief of Staff of the Crypto Task Force. Welcome to the first of a series of roundtables in the Securities and Exchange Commission's spring sprint toward crypto clarity, how we got here and how we get out defining security status.
This is as high as the volume goes.
Constructive engagement between the Commission and the public on issues related to crypto has been a long time coming. But over the past several weeks, the Crypto Task Force has been meeting with market participants and has received considerable written input as well. These conversations and materials have been extraordinarily helpful, and we hope that market participants and members of the public will continue to request meetings and make written submissions. But we're also excited to begin this next stage of our own ongoing engagement with the public in a format that invites more parties to engage with each other in an open discussion of key issues in this space. Given the range of views held by today's participants, we expect the conversation to be lively, provocative, and productive. Our hope is that the cumulative result of this engagement will be to enable the task force to help the Commission develop the regulatory framework for crypto in a way that promotes innovation while protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitating capital formation. Before I turn the podium over to our three commissioners, I would like to remind everyone that this event is being streamed live and is being covered by multiple media outlets. Accordingly, please be aware that all remarks by Commission officials, participants, and members of our audience will be on the record. In addition, please remember that the participants in today's roundtable speak on their own behalf and that their views do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission, the Commissioners, or members of the Commission staff. With that, I would like to ask our acting chairman, Mark Ueda, followed by Commissioner Crenshaw and Commissioner Peirce, who will each offer some thoughts to set the stage for this afternoon's conversation. Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you so much for that, Richard. And good afternoon, and welcome to the Crypto Task Force's inaugural roundtable, which will explore the complex legal issues involved in classifying crypto assets under the federal securities laws. But first, I really want to thank all of our panelists today and all of you in the audience for taking time out of what is a lovely day here in Washington, D.C. to be with us today. And particularly with this panel, I've had the privilege of knowing many of the panelists for, if not years, decades, and have looked at their writings and their thoughts. And I'm really pleased that we have such a diverse set of perspectives that you'll hear from today. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, a group or a person going by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto released a white paper describing a new peer-to-peer electronic cash system called Bitcoin that helped form an entirely new digitally native asset class. 17 years later, market participants, lawyers, academics, policymakers, and regulators are still grappling with critical questions related to the status of these novel crypto assets under the federal securities laws. This disagreement is most pronounced when it comes to the application of the investment contract test established by the Supreme Court in its
The Howey test. So there's tens of thousands of tokens that have been launched on various chains, and depending on whether the government is going to regulate them as securities, determines how it'll be taxed, how it'll be governed, who can trade it. Bitcoin has been categorized as not a security, and I think that Ethereum is officially not a security, but I don't know if the legislation had said that yet.
1946 decision in SEC versus W.J. Howey Company with respect to crypto assets. The challenges in applying Howey's investment contract test, though, are not unique to crypto. In fact, I've got a little bit of firsthand experience with it. As chief advisor to the California Corporations Commissioner, I stood before a California Court of Appeal and argued that the offering of a non-security certificate of deposit, when packaged with a separate receipt of a bonus payment, constituted an investment contract. Although the state court concluded that it was not, other federal appellate courts had held that similar arrangements do satisfy the Howey test. Now, in the years following Howey, various courts of appeals are split on various nuances and other aspects of that decision. For example, does Howey require the pooling of investor funds and pro rata distribution of profits? Or is it sufficient that investors need only share the risks with the promoter? In some circuits, the fortunes of all investors must depend on the promoter's expertise. But in other circuits, the fortunes of the investor must be interwoven with and dependent upon the efforts and success of those seeking the investment or of third parties. Similarly, the courts of appeal are divided as to whether an investment contract requires post-sale efforts by the promoter or if significant pre-purchase managerial activities undertaken to ensure the success of the investment suffices.
So a lot of us who are tuning into this, we may have been in crypto for a few years, but the traditional and legacy financial system uh, are coming in now, and they have decades and their full life of experience within the capital markets. So this is a big learning experience, and since I know a thing or two, not that I'm an expert, but it's quite interesting to learn about the SEC and the CFTC and how these new digital assets are going to be perceived and regulated throughout the world, not just in the US, but in terms of adoption throughout all the countries.
Now, differences in opinions among various courts is not unusual. After all, a judicial opinion is limited to the particular facts and circumstances of that case. When judicial opinions have created uncertainty for market participants in the past, the Commission and its staff have stepped in to provide guidance. For example, the Commission clarified the meaning of an investment advisor's fiduciary duty under Section 206 of the Advisors Act in response to industry demand. The Commission also opined on the application of Howey to the offer and sale of whiskey warehouse receipts and condominiums, among other things. This approach of using notice and comment rulemaking or explaining the Commission's thought process through releases rather than enforcement actions should have been considered for classifying crypto assets under the federal securities laws. Today's roundtable is an important first step in addressing that concern. So thank you again to the many members of our staff who are on the Crypto Task Force, as well as our panelists and our participants and the interested public for your time in preparing for this roundtable, and I look forward to the discussions that follow.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. Appreciate all the panelists' time. Appreciate you all being here. I anticipate the discussion today around two big questions. One, are crypto assets securities subject to SEC jurisdiction under existing law? And two, should they be? Enhancing regulatory clarity is a laudable goal. So is a reasoned policy debate. As long as our goal is to promote compliance with, and not avoidance of, a legal framework that is faithful to the SEC's mission to protect investors and markets. As we delve into today's topics, we must bear in mind that the stakes could not be higher. You will be discussing the legal underpinnings of the $120 trillion U.S. capital markets, which remain the envy of the world. The financial well-being of tens of millions of Americans and countless American businesses depends on consistent and effective regulation of our markets. This regulation rests on a well-built edifice of law that, over the last 90-some years, has been duly built up by Congress and the courts. At the foundation of that structure is the definition of security. And the Commission has used this definition for decades to successfully regulate an incredibly diverse array of financial products. We cannot poke holes in the foundation without expecting the walls may crack. Modifying the law to facilitate the success of a chosen product category is fraught with risk. Risk not only of weakening regulatory protections for that category, but of creating a negative domino effect on other areas of the market protected by the same laws. For the SEC, holistic protection of the markets has always been and must remain our North Star. That said, I understand there is a view that current law is not working for crypto. And I agree that policy must keep pace with new products and technologies. I welcome the diversity of views and urge you to present those views with careful consideration of the potential benefits and costs of
A lot of the people in crypto or invested in some digital assets that the Securities Exchange Commission have come after have been like a chilling effect on the price. So while the SEC claims to be protecting investors, they've actually hurt investors with what a lot of people have called regulatory overreach. And so we're all kind of watching this now, like the regulations are solidifying. So it's kind of an important time for people in the crypto industry and in terms of mass adoption worldwide.
proposed actions. This means asking, for example, what authority does the Commission have to make such changes? How do you balance the desire for greater clarity with the need for a sufficiently flexible definition of security that cannot be easily evaded? Does the contemplated change protect investors, the capital markets, and national security? This is critical given the heightened risks associated with crypto assets, including, just to name a few, their speculative nature, a disproportionately high volume of scams and frauds, lack of legal redress available against bad actors that are unidentifiable or located abroad, and use of crypto assets to finance crime and terrorism.
Which is,
If the
those are
intention
all the arguments that they placed against Bitcoin in the early days. Oh, it's only used by criminals on the dark web. Oh, it's funding terrorism. Oh, it's a speculative bubble. It's not safe for normal people to participate in. All these things where the fear put on Bitcoin in the early days, and now it's like, hey, we liked you all along. But for the rest of the industry, that we're seeking lots of clarity right now, and I think this year will be the one where a lot of that is understood by everybody. Because if the SEC goes after things that aren't securities, they're harming investors and they're not abiding by the law.
is to create a special rule for crypto assets, how can those assets, either as a group or by specific type, be clearly defined and differentiated from other types of assets to which those rules are not intended to apply? Will any new legal framework for crypto assets deliver a similar level
Yeah,
of
not all
investor
cryptos
and
are the
market
same.
protections to that of other similar asset classes? Will it provide a level playing field among all market participants? I look forward to hearing a variety of viewpoints today on these and other issues. Thank you for the Crypto Task Force for organizing this event, and thank you again to all the participation and your engagement with the Commission.
Who's next? Hester Pierce?
We're about to get this show on the road, so don't worry. I'm not going to talk too long. But
Oh,
thank
she's
you
crypto
to
mom, right?
Richard, to Chairman Ueda, Commissioner Crenshaw, and thank you to all the panelists for taking your time to be here today and bring us your expertise. And thanks to those of you in the audience here and
Hester
watching
Purse.
online. I'm delighted to welcome
P-E-I-R-C's
everyone today
Purse.
to the inaugural roundtable of the spring sprint toward crypto clarity, which is actually quite hard to say, but it's actually harder to do. So we're going to see that
Crypto
later.
clarity.
Thank you to our panelists. You do bring years of experience and serious consideration of the topic at hand to the table. And I think as Chairman Ueda and Commissioner Crenshaw laid out, we're approaching these issues in the context of well-developed securities laws, and we are working with those laws to try to get to a place where people can easily and consistently apply them in the crypto context. It's fitting that today's panel takes place exactly 2 months after Acting Chairman Ueda announced the formation of the Crypto Task Force.
She's commissioner of the SEC, appointed by Trump this year.
And just as DC is brimming full of the early signs of spring, spring signifies new beginnings, and we have a new beginning here, a restart of the Commission's approach to crypto regulation. The formation of the Crypto Task Force gave permission to staff working in the building to seek earnestly to find a workable framework for crypto regulation, and staff have responded with palpable enthusiasm. I think there's enthusiasm in the room here as well, so let's seize the moment and have a meaningful conversation today. I think there are lots of people in this room who have been thinking about these issues for a very long time on the panel, in the audience, so I think we're ready for the sprint ahead. The Roundtable series that we're starting today will allow us to explore issues collaboratively. I'm reminded of a story that my brother told me recently about how he had a shed on his property that was really in great disrepair, and he was going to pull it down. And a friend of his came over who was very handy, and so he brought his friend back and said, "Hey, shouldn't I just pull this thing down?" And his friend said, "Pull it down? Are you kidding? Let's build it." And he said, "Well, okay, we can rebuild it, but my tractor is broken, and we're going to need that." His friend said, "Well, let's repair the tractor." So that day, they not only repaired the tractor, but they also put the shed up and got it shored up so that it was functioning again. And so I think that is a little bit of a model for what we're going to do today, which is we have to get the tractor running. We have to address those definitional questions, which are so key to so many of the other questions in this area.
We all like
They
Hester.
will allow us to then build a functional and efficient shed, which is the regulatory framework. And I think these people are as adept as my brother and his friend, so I'm excited to see what lies ahead. We do have some foundational questions I think that we can talk about today. Obviously, what makes something a security? Is that status permanent, or might an asset start as a security and convert to a non-security, or vice versa? How does decentralization affect our
I
analysis,
think
if at all?
XRP
Can we
was one of
translate?
those that they ruled that it was a security. And then there's such things that happen in regards to Ripple, and then the coin is XRP, but Ripple is separate from the coin. So maybe it was a security in the beginning, but the secondary sales of the XRP token are not securities. And that's why a lot of the exchanges delisted XRP.
The characteristics of a security into a simple taxonomy that will cover the many different types of crypto assets that exist today and may exist in the future. So thank you to everyone who made the roundtable possible today. There's been a lot of work that's gone into it by people throughout the building. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I'm going to hand it over to our former commissioner, Troy Paredes, who's going to moderate this group. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank the entirety of the commission for not only hosting this, but certainly for the opportunity afforded me to moderate. I'm looking forward to a lively and engaging conversation, and it's certainly great to be back at the commission. The panelists have lots of different views, and I think that's what makes for a great panel. And if everybody was of the same view, we probably wouldn't need to be here, and the commission wouldn't have seen fit to host all of us today. So it should be a great conversation. The goal, very much consistent with what's already been said, but just to offer a particular take on it, is a very simple starting point from at least my perspective, which is everything is something. And it may be a security, but it may not be a security. And so as I've often thought about it, this what is it question, or perhaps more aptly put, what are they question, has never been, I think, more front and center in the history of the federal securities laws, at least not insofar as I can consider or recall. I've taught Howey many times back in my law professor days, and I used to teach it out of almost a sense of obligation. And then all of a sudden, wow, it's one of the most important cases in the history of Supreme Court jurisprudence involving the federal securities laws. So it really is amazing to see how things have continued to develop in the context of securities regulation and otherwise, and that's no small part because of what the pace and magnitude of innovation has been over the last handful of years. So as was mentioned, the focus today is on what's security, how do you define it, what does that mean particularly in the context of crypto assets, sometimes called tokens or digital assets. I'm sure we'll use those words.
Well, all the people that like HEX, they don't think it's a security, and this is using the Howey test. And Richard Hart himself said it was designed specifically to not be a security, like Bitcoin is not a security.
Interchangeably. Before we jump in, let me walk through some game plan so that everybody is on the same page. I'll run through a number of items. I'll do this quickly, and then we will get into the substance. So here's the game plan. I'm going to call on people. The first three, though, and I've not told them this yet, but they're about to hear. So the first three, so no one's caught off guard, are going to be Chris, and then Teresa, and then Sarah, and then we'll proceed from there. Next, in the initial go around, I'd ask that you keep your responses to a couple of minutes or so. There is so much for us to get into, and the conversation is sure to be engaging and interesting, so we want to make sure we have plenty of time for you all to engage with one another. When responding, just your name and affiliation. Your bios are available on the Commission's webpage, extraordinarily impressive bios. So if you can just give your name, your affiliation, and encourage folks to take a look at the more complete bios that are available. Please keep it engaging and interactive. Feel free to react to folks, respond to folks, riff off what somebody else has said. If you need to get my attention, my ask is lean forward, wave your hand, stand up, whatever it is, and get my attention. You can also pipe up, and everybody will do that in a respectful way, I'm sure. If I interrupt, it's only so we have plenty of opportunity to hear from everybody. I hope I don't have to interrupt, but I won't be shy if I need to make sure we hear what everybody has to say. I would ask also that folks be as precise as they can be and define their terms. One of the things that I personally find challenging is there are so many new words or different words. Sometimes folks use the same word to mean different things. Sometimes folks use different words to mean the same thing. So I think if everybody understands precisely what it is that you're referring to when you use a particular phrase or a term, I think that'll help motivate the conversation as well. In addition to saying what you think, I would encourage everybody to say why you think it. I think that's a key part as well to make sure the conversation flows. A few final quick game plan points. I'd ask that you don't make any specific reference or even innuendo, if you will, to actual enforcement actions. And so keep it general if you're talking about anything that touches on something that might be related in some way or another to enforcement.
To an ongoing
Commissioner Peirce and the members of the task force, if there's something you want me to do, feel free to come up here and tell me to do it. I'm happy to take instruction. This is really about a discussion that's most useful for all of you, and so feel free to pass me a note or raise your hand or whatever, and chime in any way that's helpful. I think we go for about an hour and a half, and I think until 3 East Coast time. So we'll keep to that. Then we'll have a break, and then after the break, my understanding is that there will be questions that folks have submitted from the audience, whether it's folks here who are joining in person. I think there's a way to submit written questions, and I think for folks who may be watching and joining us online, my understanding is if you were to email, and Samira or somebody will tell me if I'm wrong on this, crypto@sec.gov, then and if you put in the subject line roundtable question, then we'll be able to take those into consideration as well, and we'll work through those during the break. At least some of us will, and then be ready for after the break. Final point is there is more to it than Howie. Howie gets a lot of the attention, and for understandable reason, but there's more to it than that. And so certainly encourage folks not to feel as though this is only a discussion about Howie. It's a broader discussion by nature, even though Howie is certainly a key part of it. So with that, let me turn, as I indicated, to Chris. So Chris, you have a unique perspective.
Howie is the
professor as well as the CEO.
You have to
as well as,
pass all legs of the Howie to be
two different boards.
not
what are one
regulated
or two
by
considerations
the SEC
that you think should drive the determination as to whether a particular crypto asset is or is not a security? And to what extent, as somebody yourself who's thought a lot about disclosure that's related, how has your thinking about what's the most relevant disclosure when it comes to crypto assets or different kinds of crypto assets informed your assessment?
So thank you for that. My name is Chris Brummer. I'm a professor over at Georgetown Law. I am the CEO of Blueprint, a crypto disclosure company, and I am the former good friend of Troy for making me go first. So
I think we're still good friends, no?
Okay. Let me just go for a little bit of a running start because it's important that
Chris Brummer.
This kind of conversation is difficult because
Brummer.
we're all, on the one hand, a little bit of philosophers because we're talking about the nature of securities law, but we're also auto mechanics, which I take as our objective to come up with some actionable road items. When I think about putting on the philosopher hat for 15, 20 seconds, when I think about the Howey test, just in general, because that is sort of this over-encompassing standard, it's a lot smarter than people would think. Certainly there are some limitations when it comes to crypto assets, but the logic behind it is actually pretty interesting when you think about each of the individual prongs. Ultimately, each of those prongs represents a kind of a risk that the gods of securities law have said when they are collectively there, we're going to mandate disclosure, as Troy had mentioned. We're basically saying when you have savings, there's an issue of investor protection. The common enterprise prong that we're all familiar with is really addressing a kind of free riding problem, almost like when you teach to a large room of students and you ask them to raise their hand and nobody raises their hand. Everyone's being a very rational actor. And so it goes to this question of whether or not there's going to be an under-provisioning of information. The efforts of others prong, it really just goes to information asymmetries. And then the question of sort of profits goes to investor psychology, greed and fear, the kinds of things that can distort decision making. And basically, when you have all those factors together, you have a mandated disclosure requirement. Now, many of those factors, I would say, are this is a very old rule. This is right after the New Deal, and it's premised on pieces of paper and the kinds of risks that accompany transactions when information was distributed through pieces of paper. When you move to any kind of new technology, we're obviously talking about crypto now, but certainly a digital technology, the underlying risks relating to each of those prongs can change in different and interesting ways. And so when you ask me what am I actually, or what do I think a securities law regime or any kind of regime for crypto assets should look like, it should certainly address the fundamental sort of risks that would involve any kind of transaction when you have a collectivity of these underlying concerns, but it also has to address the changes of the technology, the backdrop behind which the transactions themselves are being consummated. This is not just a question of whether or not the regime is efficient for the market, but it's also how do you best protect investors. And I think that the two
Protect investors. Do you need protection?
What are the specific risks? I'm going to break it down to three. What are the particular risks? Are those risks reflecting this sort of old 90-year-old regime in terms of the sort of meta concerns? And then are there things that are interesting about the technology that require adaptation to those risks? Questions like predictability, which has not always been Howey's strongest point, become more important when you're dealing with a technology like this because we're talking about digital information, information that can be programmed, information that can be embedded in different kinds of transactional systems.
Yes, Bitcoin is a technology.
To comply faster, easier, more effectively. So what does that mean in terms of our analysis? In terms of the overall reach, last little bit and point, securities have always, I have a job as a securities law professor because I can give exams where things don't fit neatly into a category of securities law. That's you guys may take that job away now. But ultimately, it's in that gray zone that there's always been some kind of ambiguity, but does the ambiguity sort of rise to a level where you can no longer sort of build things? And when it does, you have to do a little bit of an assessment about what are the risks, what are the opportunities, we already heard that before, and then to think creatively and to build systems like you have iteratively to deal with those. So I'm looking to see that in a particular regulatory system, and there are many ways in which an auto mechanic can get this done, but they have different kinds of trade-offs, and I'm sure we'll talk about those trade-offs over the course of the semester/session.
Thanks, Chris.
So yeah, we need people that are technical, that are technicians to understand the technology. Otherwise, the laws around it might not be fair, or they don't make sense, or they're created based off of like power dynamics, which is definitely a part of it. But we need people that really understand the technology, how the different coins are actually different programs, like Microsoft Outlook versus YouTube. They're both applications, right? So
Teresa, so you have the perspective of being in private practice and doing enforcement related work as well as transactional related work. And as I understand it, you focused a lot in your thinking on the topic we're talking about today around things like rights, duties, other characteristics and attributes that attend to a particular crypto asset or some arrangement, think about it from an investment contract perspective or otherwise. So can you expound upon that aspect and the ways in which right, duties, characteristics, features, whichever word or words you think are the best to use, are informative to the determination as to whether or not there is or is not a security? And how does that align? Does it align, or is it a different approach and perspective from what Chris was saying in terms of starting with the risks, right? As I understood Chris's point was you got to start with the risk and do some version of a risk mapping. Not that that's the only thing you do, but that's an important piece of the overall assessment. How does your perspective align with that, or is it a different take on the question?
No, thanks so much. And I'm Teresa Goodickian, a partner at Baker Hostetler. So I agree with Chris in that I think that risk mapping is an important part of the analysis. My analysis starts at a different place, and it's a much more fundamental level. And looking at it, and I don't want to get hung up like on too many words with, what is a right or an interest. Just I am using Black's Law Dictionary definition if anybody wants to know what I'm referring to, which is very broad.
Well, we do want to
But
understand these words.
in looking at this, what are these? And I think that's exactly what the question is. And they can be many different types of things. And I think it's a looking at what are the various rights and interests and obligations that are a part of them, that come from them, that they represent. So, and I take it kind of looking back historically, when have we gone through this before? And when have we developed a business form, a new business form, and how did we approach that? And when new assets have been created, how did we analyze them? How did we group them? How did we just determine how to regulate them? And first it starts with these interests, and I'll talk about it a little bit deeper in a second, but those rights, interests, obligations, anything that's there, because everything is something. It's not just nothing. Air is air. It's not nothing, right? So there's everything is something, and then by looking at that, you can start to look at these different types of relationships and transactions. And it's a much deeper kind of analysis than I think, is people are kind of engaging a lot of the time in. It's a very much more basic level. And from there, you can look at what then are like the risks. What are, there's always some sort of an assumption of risk when you have any kind of a transaction, and that's kind of what the negotiation is. Somebody bears some sort of risk, and there's usually some sort of economic incentive, or there's some incentive for that. And
well, the risks I can see in cryptocurrency is how centralized it is. If you have someone that can roll back transactions or invalidate your wallet address, freeze your funds, like that's risk. There's also the risk in code. Like if the code just has bugs or backdoors, or the founders or the developers that created it can shut it off, that's definitely a risk. But for immutable blockchains that's sufficiently decentralized, everybody has to agree to roll back the chain, which would invalidate previous transactions, which is what Bitcoin is. So the risk is the code and how much power the founders or the developers have over it. Is a risk. Otherwise, the code is what it is. You cannot change it. Everything is secure, and you don't need to trust anybody else. Since you don't need to trust anybody else, the code is what it does, and it's going to keep doing that. So by eliminating these third parties, eliminating counterparty risk, that is reduction in risk, which is good, which is why Bitcoin was invented, is to remove the middlemen and allow secure transfer of value.
And from moving forward, how do these things move together? What are their characteristics? How are they similar? How do they move in a market? Like commodities in stock.
The risk of price, right?
And how does that work? Like you can see that some things are correlated, some things are not. When there's high inflation, you see more commodities being purchased. And so there's an interrelation between all of these things and between the people.
Can the price
so it's not
be
just
manipulated?
the assets, it's also the relationship between all of the different actors. And just because I'm not acting myself, but I'm acting through some autonomous something, or I create something that then can go out and behave on its own, that does not mean that it doesn't exist because there's no human. Like it always starts from a human, right? And if I do something, if I put some code out there and it creates something, that becomes there's some sort of warrant of merchantability, there's some sort of fitness of use, like there's lots of.
If you created some blockchain code and published it and removed the ability to modify that code after you published it, it is what it is. It's going to stay there forever as it is, and no one's going to be able to change it. So the next question is the code good? Like, will it work the way it was intended to work, or will it fail? So there's the risk in that respect.
Different theories of property, of economic principles of the law, of business forms, of torts, right? Reasonable person duty. Like you still have duties that may then be, you might breach, and it may proximately cause somebody else's injury. And if I do that through, a human being, or I do it through something else, something that's autonomous, you still have to think about how all of these things work together. And if you go back and look at when a corporation was first created, the corporate form, originally it was me, I had a business and I operated that business and I was fully liable, my person. You could come after my house. Then we separated out liability. And then I had me, my business, but you could only come after my business. My house was safe, right? And then we separated this, and with shareholders, with ownership being separate from control, and instead of groups of people putting their money in and all working together to do something, they started getting other people to invest. And it's actually, in the grand scheme of things, not that long ago, in 1904, there's this Corporation Commission report talking about the experiment of a corporation. And all of these various incentives, thinking that the law went too fast and it created this
So
these
corporations
incentives that weren't
are really
aligned,
an invention
and
that's a
created
little
market
over 100
issues
years old.
and fraud and all these other things that we learn about. We talked about for the 29 crash. And they had to look at and
Yeah,
these questions
1929.
of,
Oh
this is
yeah.
new. If I separate wealth,
That's the one
my
where you
property
had people jumping out of buildings. The markets crashed so hard.
of wealth, if I'm separate from it and I give it to somebody else to manage, do I still have those same rights to that wealth that I used to have, that I had when I was doing it? And this was a question that had to be answered. And I think similarly, we're reaching a point here where there are some of those very fundamental questions we need to answer. And so, for example, if you look at it as, and this is not my idea, this is Adolf Berle's idea, but if you have, thinking of a shareholder as having passive property, they don't do anything with it, and you have the manager having the active property because they control it. He thought, what happens one day could you have a property interest in that active property? And I think that the DLT is what created that ability, and that is a new right we haven't seen before.
DLT as in digital ledger technology.
So particularly with governance tokens, and not all, even governance tokens are different. So that's why we really have to think about what are these, because so a governance token is kind of unbundling and debundling of things that we've already been recognizing. And so
Government tokens too is like what's been called a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, which is where updates to the code can be voted on. If it doesn't pass the vote, then you can't update the code or do something else in regards to the project. So generally, the founders of the coins, they own the majority of the coins. Imagine that. And so they can basically control how the project unfolds because they have the majority share of vote. They own the majority share of the coins themselves, which I think is actually quite good because in one way, should we launch a meme coin on Ethereum? Like you can vote on that. It doesn't really have much effect on anything important. But in regards to the future of a layer one blockchain, do you really want meme coin degens like voting? Like generally no. Like you want the smartest people to decide how the project unfolds, which is why corporations, they last a long time. They don't let someone else outside that doesn't know anything about it decide the future of the company. So there's this gray area of like having a DAO within your token, within your project, making it more decentralized, but it's not really because there's still centralization of ownership.
I have the
Anyway,
ability in a very small part to control with my vote. And then, but so I own it and I'm controlling it, but only a very small part, so I don't really have the ability to do a big change unless I'm with a bunch of other people or I own a ton of it. But generally speaking, that's what it is. And that's tradable. So this is now a property interest in active property, and we've never had it. So I think it's at least worth asking, what?
it's like if you owned 30% of Amazon stock shares, you could actually control the future of the company. But generally, if you own stocks in a company, you can't control what products are on the shelf. You can't do a lot of things. You can't really do much. Like owning a stock now is just a speculative interest in the price going up or down
What is that? What does that
for the
mean?
most part.
How should we think about that? And getting to really like to do that and how the securities laws applies is to ask, what is the sine qua non of a security? It's not
Sine
Howie.
qua non.
Howie's the
What is that?
definition of an investment contract. There's lots of other things. Howie does not apply to evidence of indebtedness. Howie does not apply to voting trust certificates. That's not the test. And so I think we need to look more at what is it? There's some sort of an economic interest.
It's technology, and the value of the tokens are purely speculative.
If you think about
It's amazing they're worth anything at all.
these DLT networks, not as just some piece of technology, but more in the fourth kind of industrial revolution we're in, as like a new business form, a new way of doing things, a new way of allocating resources.
So if you own percent of the total coins, then you don't own any part of the company, but you own a share of that value.
It becomes much bigger than that of thinking through what these actually are. And
Like, what is the value of Bitcoin? Price versus value. Being able to send value across countries' borders without anyone asking your name and social and your address and why you're sending the money. Like, there is some value that no one can censor your transfer of money. Yeah, like that has value. That's why the price went up.
And I encourage everybody to dig a little deeper in trying to figure out what they are.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have Chris.
Teresa Goody
Paraphrasing, and I'm
Gullen.
sure I'm going to get things wrong here, but Chris talking about
Good
risk,
opening statement, and so
and Teresa talking in a very fun way about rights.
everybody's
duties,
giving their opening
obligations,
statements now.
raises
So
questions about under what
this is a
circumstances does
4-hour
somebody owe
long
obligations
committee
to
hearing.
others,
So
and
I'm
in
sure
a
we'll
way
get
that
more
gives
detailed
rise to
things going on later.
liabilities, and how does that through an obligation responsibility? How does somebody owe obligations to others? And in a way that gives rise to legal liabilities, and how does that through an obligation responsibility, how does that flow through in terms of thinking about jurisdictional questions, like what's a security? And then, Sarah, I'd mentioned that you were going to be third. And
do a quick research on the legs of the Howey test.
General counsel. And
this is how the Securities and Exchange Commission should determine whether something is a security and whether they have any jurisdiction to oversee it and regulate it. The 4 legs of the Howey test.
so how do I have that right? At my job? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, at your job. Yeah, sorry. I do a lot of things, activism on the side. Oh, okay, yeah, so I was thinking about that job. Sorry about your job, if I got that right. I think I have that right. So you're dealing with these things in a very practical way is the point, which is a different vantage point in terms of being House and having those responsibilities, a different vantage point. So what's the biggest challenge that you face in trying to wrestle with this question as to whether or not something is or is not a security? Because to make a implicit point that's come through Express, the security question is so consequential because it determines jurisdiction. It determines regulatory jurisdiction. So it's not, yes, it's an interesting academic question, but it's a very practically consequential question. And even if it's not a security and therefore there's not jurisdiction by the SEC, well, then it's, again, something, and so somebody else has got jurisdiction. And so how do you wrestle with that? What's the biggest challenge wrestling with that? And is there a particular thing that you think the commission could do or should really consider doing that you think would really move things forward, not to the exclusion of other considerations, but one that may really stand out from your perspective?
So I think that the specter of the application of securities laws has moved early stage projects in the market to sort of take an arc very similar to IPOs where they stay private longer. These assets in the traditional model are designed to have wide, broad, early distribution. And most of the market is hedging that on the application of securities laws, so it ends up looking a lot like your traditional markets where people will basically marshal, their way to an exchange listing without that broad dissemination or price support or, actually fully launching the technology. And we see more and more the token is the product. There's attention to
Like token launching with a roadmap. We're going to do these things later on, but our token's launched and it's trading on the exchanges. And oftentimes when the coin gets put on an exchange like Binance or Coinbase or something like this, they have to give a little piece of the action to the exchange. So they give some coins as the exchange fee, or they just pay a big monetary surcharge to get listed. And that's totally up to the exchange, how much that is.
economy models, and prices being more, I guess, there's different ways that people are artificially supporting price, like the high FDV, low float model that's come, and it's generally been, I'd say, sort of toxic.
FDV is fully diluted value or volume.
Market, with everything structured to avoid intricate structuring to
Valuation, FDV.
I guess hedge downside that you're complying along the way with securities laws.
Total value of the project.
Deemed to be a security.
And so to pick up on that, now John, I'm going to go to you. From your perspective, having heard Chris's take, Teresa's take, Sarah's take, 3 different takes, and I think that's the whole point here to see the different perspectives on this. From your perspective, John, you've had a lot of opportunity over the years to think about the intersection of technology and our capital markets and technology and finance and securities regulation beyond just right now in the context of blockchain technology and crypto assets. So how would you suggest that the commission adopt, if you think they need to adopt or adapt, a technology neutral approach to the question of what's a security? And very much related to that, are there circumstances under which you would say, well, if a particular crypto asset had these attributes or rights or obligations or interest, or a lack of these attributes or rights or obligations or interest, or to pick up on Chris's point, these risks or not these risks, that you would say without being perhaps conclusive about it, well, under that condition, that particular crypto asset most likely would not be a security?
Well, thanks, Troy. Thank you for everyone, and I'm really honored to be among this group. It's an incredible group of attorneys, and Commissioner Pierce, who I knew when she was a staff attorney, I can't say enough amazing words about her and about this task force. I think it's an incredible idea to really recommend and figure out what you want to tell Congress with respect to securities regulation. But I don't see it as something you can tell the courts, because the courts have already spoken. If you look at the statement that I wrote, and I know the statement that Professor Reiners wrote, as far as what is a security, the economic reality of the transaction, however you want to look at it, the people buying crypto are not collectors. We all know that. They're investors. And the mission of the SEC is to protect investors. And how do I know they're investors? Because whenever I go around and talk about this stuff, whether it be
because everyone
Twitter,
wants price to go
X,
up,
whatever you want to call it, in a big space, or
whatever it
minutes,
is, if it's Bitcoin or a shitcoin, they want price to go up. They're investing in the risk of price going up.
Death threats afterwards, because I'm talking literally, because I'm talking about crypto and that it should be regulated. And whether you're talking about eel farms or ostrich farms or orange groves, the whole point of securities regulation was to wrap that all up into a very big, broad, principles-based regulation. Principles-based regulation works. And if you read all the cases that I cite in
But the SEC just doesn't, they don't regulate anything that's an investment. They have to regulate things that are securities. So are they trying to redefine what a security is before they can fully regulate this new digital the DLT technology?
My statement that Professor Reiner cites, I don't think the SEC, with respectfully, can just suddenly say all these cases don't exist. We've decided that the law is different. The law right now talks about the principle, the fact that the 33 Act and the 34 Act were written to be flexible. And this kind of criticism has been around for a long time. You know, coming into the building, I worked.
And there's a website that shows every single SEC case against crypto founders, crypto projects. They've even tried to sue code. They tried to sue decentralized code.
Worked here for almost 20 years. By the way, I'm president, managing partner, CEO, and director of John Reed Stark Consulting, a company of just one. I have no stake in the crypto world or cryptoverse of any kind at all. I'm pretty much,
Sure.
you know, semi-retired. Telecom I am. Yeah, I think that, so I look at this stuff very objectively, and I think back at the 20 years that I was here. I was 11 years. I was chief of the Office of Internet Enforcement, and it's tough coming in this building today because I hadn't been here for 15 years. And my first day was September 9th, 1991. And I met a guy, Mark Lewis, who would become one of my best friends in the world for 35 years. How many best friends do you have for 35 years? You know, I have some for 50 years, but Mark was very special. And I've been thinking a lot about Mark lately because he's very sick with leukemia in New York. Why am I bringing that up today? First of all, everybody please hope for him. Second of all, Mark at the time wrote an article with then director Bill McLucas because someone had created a shadow SEC and said the SEC was overreaching with all of its regulations about things like insider trading and going off the rails and rogue in everything. And Mark and Bill McLucas wrote this, the director at the time wrote this article about principles-based regulation and the flexibility of 10b-5 and of things like Howey. And that design was specifically meant, as the Supreme Court has stated, not to cabin the scope of the definition of security.
Yeah, there's government organizations like the SEC. They're mandated with certain powers, and then there's what they actually do with those powers. And it's been a problem with digital assets today as well, not just in the 90s.
So when you look back at these transactions, these people are buying this because they're investors. And the SECs, like I said, their mission is.
Can you label people investors because they buy something? Like define investor. Do you have to hold for a year, or can you just day trade? Is day trading investing? Usually when I think of investing, and I'm not sure the legal definition or the Black's Law dictionary definition, but investing is like a longer term thing.
Is to protect investors. And I just don't see how you can. I appreciate the idea that you can say, okay, you know what, these laws can be done better. I remember Teresa Goody's old boss, Harvey Pitt, came in. One of the first cases that I worked on was an insider trading case involving an oil well. And he came in and he said, you know, there's no definition of insider trading and there's no breach of fiduciary duty here. And my client you should leave my client alone. And he was right. You know, when we looked at it, he was right. At the time, insider trading hadn't developed to that. But it didn't mean that, you know, if we recommended that there be a new definition of insider trading, that we stop all prosecution of it or that we give up prosecution of it. You know, what it meant is, okay, maybe there can be better definition. When I worked under Commissioner Paredes at the time, there was a case called Doroshko, which involved somebody hacking into a system of a company and then trading on that system. That's what Doroshko did. He made like $5 or $10 million doing it. So we charged him. Sounds like insider trading, right? Well, the district court judge in that case said, nope, that's not insider trading, that's computer theft. And I remember I was joking with Commissioner Paredes, who called me into his office at that time, and he said, you got to stop with these cases because a district court has said that, number one, that there's no duty here, there should be a duty lurking, and this is not what insider trading is all about. And I understood that, and we stopped working on those cases. We appealed the Doroshko case, which got overturned. It was sent back because the idea was, well, maybe this hack was a deception because whoever was hacking in there had somehow masqueraded themselves as an administrator, and that was a fraud. As opposed to, it's like dressing up like a letter carrier to steal inside information. That's a fraud. That's insider trading. That's SEC jurisdiction. But if you bang on the window and you walk in, not so much, and just steal the information. So the idea was, so then they came back and it turned out the Edgar system got hacked and somebody was trading on information that they had gotten from people who had done Edgar files. So the SEC ended up bringing one of the biggest cases ever. The only case they brought during the big shutdown was against the hackers who did that. So I get it that you can have some district courts that say one thing or the other, but right now we have many, many courts. It's unbelievable really the volume of case law that has developed so quickly because all of these crypto firms, they went for this sort of delay idea and they hired the best law firms in the world. And these law firms all fought the SEC with incredible briefs, just incredible briefs. I've read every single one of them. And they lost just about, I would argue, every single time. Digital assets were securities, SAFs were securities, initial coin offerings were securities, staking products were securities, lending products were securities, all because of Howey. How can the SEC just suddenly say, you know what, the Division of Corporation Finance has decided that digital assets are not securities? I mean, there are some members of the states in the audience here.
Yeah, I don't think that you can just label everything either a security or not a security. Like you have to go by the way they determine what a security is. Just because it's digital ledger technology or it's a digital asset or it's blockchain cryptocurrency, that it's like not a security. I think that argument is wrong because you can have expectations of profit on by the work of others for a coin, which has people working. They've been allocated coins to sell in the market, pushing the price down against the investors. So there's lots of things going on.
Here, and I'm sure they're saying, well, not in my office, they're not. The SEC does not have this sort of unilateral authority. So I look, Commissioner Paredes, I look at it like, it's hard for me to call him Troy because, again, when I worked for him, he was always commissioner. But I look at it like this law has been decided and it's out there, and the SEC can't abdicate its responsibility and its mission to enforce those laws. They certainly can get together like this task force with all these brilliant people whose hearts are in the right place and say, this is different, here's what we think Congress should do. But they can't unilaterally repeal the 33 and the 34 Act because of this innovation. And I don't see it as innovation. I see the iPhone as innovation. I see the cloud as innovation. I see AI as innovation. I don't see it. I agree with Commissioner Crenshaw that the risks are tremendous and it just doesn't outweigh the benefits. Where's the utility? If it all went away tomorrow and you weren't speculating in it, you wouldn't care. So that's sort of how I look at it.
Great, thanks, John. So Miles, turning to you. So I think John's perspective, principles-based, and that essentially the courts have addressed it. And so Miles, from your perspective and the perspective of A16Z, where you're at Crypto, where you're the general counsel, what's your view in terms of not only principles-based, but in terms of the courts have spoken to it, and how does that perspective reconcile or not, as the case may be, with something that you and your firm have talked a lot about, which is decentralization in the context of crypto assets?
Sure. So I think I'll start out by saying I agree that principles-based regulation is the proper approach, and I'm in alignment with John on that fact. I think from there, though, we start to depart quite a bit. I think it's a straw man argument to say that the people up here on this panel generally don't believe in principles-based regulation and that people are looking to apply formalistic restraints to Howey that would then allow for easy circumvention. I think that there are very few proposals that actually pursue doing away with principles-based regulation, and I think that is for good reason, right? Most of us that work in the space understand that the nature of digital assets can change. What the underlying network that they relate to can be controlled by a single individual, or it can be controlled by no one and be completely autonomous. And so all of those things change the overall risk profile of it. As a result of that, I think a lot of us believe that principles-based regulation should continue to be the law of the land. The problem with principles-based regulation, though, is, as we've seen, I don't think that anyone could credibly argue that the last administration's approach to the industry accomplished any of the SEC's objectives. It did not lead to investor protection, it did not lead to capital formation, and it did not lead to efficient markets. As a result of that, the current approach is clearly a failure, and we have to do better. Now, that does.
I agree.
Some people will argue that means getting rid of principles-based regulation, applying formalistic requirements to Howey to say, hey, if you don't have a legal relationship with the issuer, then securities laws shouldn't apply. I firmly do not believe that is the case. That would allow for very easy circumvention, and such an approach would make it impossible to distinguish Bitcoin from an asset like FTT, which was basically a profits interest in FTX, where FTX promised the market that they would buy back the token with their profits from running their exchange. Right? And there was no legal relationship with people that were investing in that token, but clearly the economic reality of those transactions were that people were investing in a proxy into FTX. Pretty good sign of that being a securities transaction was that when FTX shut down, that asset went to zero, right? We do not believe that type of thing should escape the bounds of securities laws, nor do we think that you should be able to escape securities laws merely by providing some additional disclosure on it. We don't exclude brokers, we don't exclude exchanges, we don't exclude notes from being securities simply because there's disclosure provided around them.
In fact, if you're regulated and registered as a security, you have to provide disclosures.
Nor should we do so with investment contracts. But fundamentally, right, if we look at the SEC's approach, if we want to embrace the idea that we're going to do and look at substance over form, right, and we're going to focus on the substance, we have to engage with what that substance actually is, and we have to do the work of defining what that substance is.
Yes, because blockchain is code. You have to understand what the code does, and each project has its code.
That does not mean, right, continuing to not provide any guidance to the industry, right? Letting the courts decide over a period of years, right? What happens, having decisions that are at odds with one another. Yes, the SEC has won some cases. They have not won a single case that applies Howey to secondary transactions. They've only won on motions to dismiss. So it's kind of a miscategorization to speak about the cases that way.
Say again.
And on top of all of that, right, we have entrepreneurs everywhere, right? And on some cases, they have not won a single case that applies Howey to secondary transactions.
Applies Howey to secondary transactions. I think there was that case with the XRP. Like the initial allocation, like the first people to get XRP through the IPO or however they originally distributed coins, which then were sold on a market, purchased by somebody else, those coins are no longer considered securities.
They've only won on motions to dismiss, so it was kind of a miscategorization to speak about the cases that way. And on top of all of that, right, we have entrepreneurs every transactions. They've only won on motions to dismiss.
They won on motions to dismiss.
So it was kind of a miscategorization to speak about the cases that way.
So if you win against the SEC through a motion to dismiss, then you don't really learn anything. Yeah, that's kind of what's going on with the Richard Hart's case. The SEC sued Richard Hart, HEX, Pulse Chain, and PulseX. And the case looks like it might be thrown out by the judge. We have to wait until April 21st to see for sure.
And on top of all of that.
And if that's the case, then they win their motion to dismiss by it being granted, which doesn't really allow Richard's attorneys to win on the grounds of their argument that it's not a security, and we want regulatory clarity from that case.
Right, we have entrepreneurs everywhere, right, that are looking to do the right thing, and what they're faced with every day as a result of this regulatory uncertainty is bad actors taking advantage of the regulatory uncertainty to push to the limits of where securities laws potentially apply, right? Deliberately going over that line, hoping that they don't get caught. Meanwhile, the good entrepreneurs are sitting there talking to us saying, hey, why can't I do what X is doing? Well, because government inaction is not consent. That is a very hard conversation to have with entrepreneurs, and it's one that I have every single day. We are not fostering innovation. We're not protecting investors. We're not helping capital formation. So we have to engage with the substance. Our general approach and the way that we believe that the SEC should focus on the issue is to look at control. That is a technology neutral, merit neutral approach to looking at what differentiates a system like Ethereum from ownership of equity in Apple, right? Apple is a system that is controlled by humans. Ethereum is not controlled by humans. As a result of that.
Well, to a degree. You have the Ethereum Foundation that are constantly updating code, adding new features. They have roadmaps, and the network, which is hosted by the validators, those are distributed around the world. So even those are people running machines that have Ethereum. They're staking their Ethereum. They cannot move that Ethereum or sell it during the time that they're essentially staking or mining it. It's not really mining, but by staking Ethereum, you can get more Ethereum, but you cannot sell that Ethereum during that time. So that's a very general approach to saying that
controlled by humans. Ethereum is not controlled by humans.
Ethereum is not controlled by humans, in the respect that what Ethereum is doing right now, it's code running. It's been put there by humans, but now that it's there, it's just running on its own. But it can be changed, it can be modified, as long as you have the consensus of the actors and the people that are running it. It's just how you define words and really understanding what's going on. Is Ethereum controlled by people? What do you think? Is it? And to what degree? How decentralized and how distributed is it?
As a result of that, the risk profile of that underlying asset, the trust dependencies associated with that asset are very different. Teresa talked about a second
But I
ago,
still
right?
agree
She
with that.
said that one of the things that C Corps did was it allowed us to split ownership from control, right? That's a very important concept, right? Shareholders don't have direct control. They use officers and directors as their proxy. Blockchain systems, right, can have ownership without any control whatsoever. They can function autonomously, permissionlessly, trustlessly. As a result of that, the inherent trust dependencies that come up with a share of stock are not relevant for certain crypto assets that meet, control criteria. As a result of that, we do not think, right, in those cases that securities laws should apply the same way they apply to shares of equity.
Maybe I'm not understanding what he's saying, but if you own a percentage of Ethereum, you essentially have a degree of control. Where if you own a percentage share of Apple, you don't. And there's different categories of stocks. Like you can vote if you have a certain type of share, but you cannot vote if you have the other type of share. Forgive me, I don't know the names of everything because I'm not an expert in this, but that is the case, and you can look it up.
Great, thanks, Miles. So, Collins.
Miles Jennings.
We've heard
Okay.
a lot of different views. I think some instances where there's some degree of overlap and complementarity.
I'm
even
happy
to the
with
point at which there's
what
some
they're
departures.
discussing.
Some is a different
This is good.
way to frame, but not necessarily an inconsistent way to frame. Others who think, the courts have taken care of it. Others say, well, maybe they've taken care of it, but there's still confusion and a lack of clarity. And so how does that factor in, setting aside jurisprudence, set aside the role of the courts? How does that impact clarity in terms of a very practical matter? So all these different perspectives and viewpoints so far. So from your perspective, as somebody who is advising early stage companies,
Jurisprudence
again,
is the
that,
theory or philosophy
picking up
of law,
on a
legal
point that
system.
Miles was referring to, you got to give advice, you got to give counsel. You want folks to do things the right way. Of course, you have entrepreneurs who have really cool, interesting things to do. How do you counsel and advise, not in the context of your client, of course, but just as a general matter, how do you approach that? And is there a particular something that you think would be the most constructive thing the SEC could do or reconsider or double down on in order to try to
hands
achieve
off
whatever
things
you
that aren't
happen to think
securities, for one.
ought to be achieved here in this context?
Yeah, thanks. So I think kind of as a preliminary matter, one of the things that this conversation might reveal is that one of the first things I'm always talking about is whether we're in a capital formation context or some other context. And I think we beg the question a little bit when we start only focusing on capital formation, because to be frank, it's obviously a very significant part of the industry, but there are so many other elements of the industry that are affected by this downstream taxonomical question that get lost in this discussion, and that's often what I'm frequently dealing with my
Bro, talking to the
I
mic.
represent a lot of people that are in the
We cannot hear you.
centralized finance industry, and so the threshold question of what an asset isn't just relevant for capital formation in a couple of ways, and I'll give a few examples.
What an asset
When you're
is.
dealing with somebody who does something like a DeFi front end, and this is a type of application or website that provides access to an underlying protocol, there's a question first off as to whether they are providing access to that service directly or if they're acting as a mere conduit. And this is relevant because when you're looking at whether you've got this taxonomy of do you have a security or not, there's a question of, okay, well, if this thing is a security and I am actually acting in a capacity beyond just being a conduit, I may be stepping into the broker-dealer world.
Okay, here's a good example, and I like to bring up HEX because HEX is a protocol running on Ethereum. It is code, and you can interact it directly through the blockchain. So you don't need to have hex.com as the only way to interact with the protocol on the blockchain. Many people in the community have built their own front ends. Call it a conduit. There's many different conduits to run the same functions on the blockchain. It's not just like ftx.com. That's the only way you can interact. In fact, that's even a bad example because what can you actually do? It's just a token that doesn't really do much except, anyway, there's some decentralized protocols that are running, and if you can, through the command line, interact directly with that protocol, you can use those functions. or you can build a front end. It's Web3. So that's the difference. You can build your own front end, and there's already many front ends. So if the main one, like hex.com, goes offline, it's still running flawlessly.
If it's not, I may be in some other type of category. Another type of example is broker-dealer world. If it's not,
I can't
I'm
hear this
actually
guy very
acting in a
well.
capacity beyond just being a conduit, I may be stepping into the broker-dealer world. If it's not, I may be in some other type of category. Another type of example is if I'm dealing with a type of security, but it's equity or debt, and I'm going to conduct a capital formation type of transaction, what type of regime am I dealing with if I'm in Reg S? Is it a Category 1, Category 2, Category 3 security? So I think those are just two quick examples, but one of the first things that I'm always thinking about is what's the context that I'm operating in? Am I thinking about capital formation? Am I thinking about something else? And are the issues going to be the same that way?
Yeah, like I'm obviously not a finance guy, but I understand the purpose of Bitcoin. I understand decentralization. I understand the importance of decentralized versus distributed networks, such as decentralization and ownership, or decentralization and control. So this is all kind of a lesson to us, I think, that aren't finance people. Like whatever he's talking about.
It's one of the kind of deficiencies in
capital formation. I'd have to look it up to really know what capital formation is. Let's do that real quick. Get a brief understanding of capital formation. Class 12, class 11, class 9, different classes of capital formation, okay? Refers to the process of accumulating capital assets like machinery, equipment, infrastructure to enhance the economy's productivity, capacity, and future output. So if you buy machines to enhance an economy's productivity, how does capital formation fit into like owning more Bitcoin? If you own more Bitcoin, you're accumulating an asset. Someone else in the comments explained this to me.
and saying, oh, the courts have resolved this as kind of an aside, because even to the extent that we accept that every single one of these things are securities, and I don't accept that, but even if we were to accept.
That's good. He's accepting. He doesn't accept that every one of these blockchain projects is a security, and I agree.
That argument. There are so many downstream questions as a result of that that are left unanswered by courts right now, that acting as though we can just sit and say, all right, well, the courts have decided that some things are securities, we're done here, let's head back here in 20 years, is clearly insufficient. So that's one challenge. And
yes, there's a lot of cases going on right now, and the courts need some guidance too.
When I'm talking to my founders, whether it's in a DeFi context, whether it's in capital formation, whether it's something else, all of those things are in mind. And I would say that generally speaking, while I've got some maybe gaps or maybe distinctions from where I'd say Miles' kind of theories land, I'm generally aligned with, I think, the notion of control being a central feature of our assessment. Now, I think, again, that's relevant for both an exemptive framework, but also taxonomy questions. And I think that's also something that we need to maybe delineate some as we get through this conversation, because some of us are talking about purely classifying assets as securities or non-securities. That's at the top of the funnel, although arguably the very top of the funnel is, do we have.
Sorry to pause it. I'll rewind too because I didn't hear. I just quick looked up taxonomy in finance is a classification system that identifies which economic activities can be considered sustainable, guiding investors and financial institutions in directing capital towards environmentally and socially beneficial projects. Okay.
Have a securities transaction or
back a little bit.
That's also something that's an exemptive framework, but also taxonomy questions. And I think that's also something that we need to maybe delineate
Taxonomy questions.
get through this conversation, because some of us are talking about purely classifying assets as securities or non-securities. That's at the top of the funnel, although arguably the very top of the funnel is, do we have a securities transaction or do we have an exempt security? But once we get past
an exempt security,
do we have a security
meaning not a
or
security.
non-security? those are top of the funnel, I guess, questions. But after that point, I don't think we've got, what's the right word here? I guess I don't think we have the right substance to get to the sub points of our assets. So for instance, in I believe Miles's comment that they submitted, they've got a proposal where you look at, once you're in the securities world, what type of asset might this thing be? Is it an asset-backed token? Is it a token with intrinsic securities, properties? Is it some other type of thing? Those things will probably all have relevance for the type of exemptive relief that may apply.
Okay, so if it's a security that is backed by nothing but has a speculative value, that's one thing. If it's backed by real world assets, that's another thing. RWAs are actually a big part of the adoption going on now. Or you have something like Bitcoin, it has a value because it's a technology, it does something.
It doesn't necessarily mean that all those things aren't securities, but it might mean that we may not need to have certain types of disclosures for certain assets that inherently provide information in the operation of their system relative to something like FTT, which I think they refer to as company-backed tokens, where it seems very clear to me that our traditional frameworks would apply. So I guess going to, I think your original question was, what do I think is important? I do think the element of control is important. For example,
Yeah, I believe a lot of that corporate BS coin kind of shit that was like FTX or rebranded to FTT, that's probably a security. And they fucked over their investors.
exemptive frameworks, it's probably important for taxonomy questions, but I think first getting through one, delineating transactions for securities, getting a framework for just easily establishing security bucket versus a non-security bucket, and then looking within that security bucket and saying, okay, if we're going to have exemptive frameworks, does something like Reg D work for these types of things? I posit that it doesn't. Something like, Commissioner Purse's 195 framework or some of the other people's frameworks.
So I think what he's saying is if it's deemed a security, if this crypto asset is a security, maybe it's not even an asset, it's just it's a crypto of some kind, crypto security, we'll call it that if it's a security. How will the Securities and Exchange Committee regulate it? I don't know. I really don't care because I'm not interested in crypto securities. I'm interested in real digital assets, crypto assets, real decentralized, no ownership, completely running on the blockchain with no admin keys, can't be changed. It's immutable, it's done, it's complete, it's on the blockchain forever. That's what I like. That's what I think Bitcoin was invented for. And all the speculation around what has the better narrative uh, is kind of bogus. And it's promoted by huge marketing companies to to uh, be known by everybody that's interested in this stuff. But yet the real blockchains that are running, that have the best technology, are not promoted by these companies because it's done. There's a big difference. And I'm really hoping that this year and next year we get some clarification on what these true DeFi and real crypto projects and products are, so that we can leave all this security stuff behind. And if TradFi wants to use it for their purposes, fine. But I don't want to trade securities. I want real stuff like Bitcoin and HEX and maybe Veritasium if that turns out to be anything in the future. There's other things too, like there's like a mixed centralized and decentralized projects which are running, and because they're centralized to a degree, the code can be made better and better over time. But we should know that. That's what the disclosure should be. I think there's very few products out there that are doing something innovative and unique that are running on the blockchain immutably and they cannot be changed. And that's what I think people should be really curious about and research more, because otherwise there's 30,000 tokens that you have to choose between if you want to invest in this stuff.
Frameworks up here probably within frameworks, does something like Reg D work for these types of things? I posit that it doesn't. Something like, Commissioner Purse's 195 framework or some of the other people's frameworks up here probably surface more relevant information than our current exemptive frameworks. And so I go back to kind of my point earlier. I think it's hard to say right now, even if we all accepted that every single thing was security, we'd still be doing the public a good service by saying the current framework works, fine.
And so, Collins, I take the point there, and feel free to correct.
And Reg D is SEC Reg D provides exemptions from the Securities Act of 1933, allowing companies to raise capital privately from accredited investors without full registration process and requires filing a Form D. So it's a regulation for securities.
Correct me if I summarize at a high level incorrectly, and then Ben, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, please summarize that, because I didn't
in
really
no
hear
small
everything he
part
said.
that, yes, the discussion of is something a security or not, but that, as you said, that's top of the funnel, that even as to whatever ends up being put into the security bucket, that there are nuances and distinctions within that bucket that then has other effects that one would need to take into account, so that the security, not security, important, but there are subtleties to that, particularly when you get to other topics.
Yeah, he's saying
that,
yes.
The task
I
force
agree.
will be taking
Sure.
up, which is more about how you substantively regulate. Well, that's not
the nuance in different technologies, even if they're securities, is there, and the government can regulate it and whatever they want, according to what it is. Fine.
topic today, the classification and the disaggregation of the entirety of the is it a security, yes bucket, that disaggregation, classification, nuance, not all assets in that bucket are the same as all other assets, you think proves to be important when it comes to the substantive regulation that they'll get to down the road.
Yeah, I think I'd say it's probably critical, to be honest. I mean, I think today, if we solve the problem of like, hey, what's a security and what's a non-security, so many questions, right? Like Rule 12G, for instance, like, can I have 2,000 holders of a token or not? Well, that's going to depend on what it's a security. Is it an equity or is it a debt security? That's not resolved by somebody telling me today that like the thing is a security. So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical.
Great, Ben.
And yeah, I definitely agree with Colin. It's critical that we have these two buckets. Is it a security or is it not a security?
You two have unique perspective. You were at the commission for a long time. Now you're at a.
I think we'll find out a lot about this year.
Policy, where you're focusing
for sure
on policy. So given that, I wanted to focus with you on, and in some sense it goes back to what Chris was saying, but I think there's a current of it across the comments, including what John was saying, which is that one can take a step back and think about what are the overall driving policy considerations that inform the federal securities laws as they have long existed. And then when one identifies those policy considerations, how does that inform? One doesn't want to overstate, but I think the point is how does that then inform how you think about the threshold question, whether something is or isn't a security, or the type of security it is, even if it is a security. So as you've approached it, how does policy generally, but the policy that motivates the federal securities laws, inform that assessment as to whether or not something is or isn't a security, given what the objective of the federal securities laws are to begin with?
Thanks very much, and let me thank the SEC and the Crypto Task Force for this event and for having me. I want to echo what John said about Commissioner Purse. It's been a privilege to work with her in the past, and I have nothing but the highest respect for her and the work that she does. As to the question, I think the policy is so fundamental to this question.
I didn't expect his voice to sound like that.
Because I think what has to underlie every policy decision that the SEC makes is the SEC's mission. And I totally believe in the three-part mission. I believe capital formation is important, I believe fair and efficient markets are important, but I also believe investor protection is very, very important. And so when you're thinking about the question of what is a security, I think you have to think about, well, how can you best protect investors? And so I think about it from the perspective of investors, and I agree with what John said, that from my perspective, investors are purchasing crypto assets as an investment. And I think that that should inform
Like, maybe not though. Like, you can't just say that they are. Anybody that's participating in the blockchain is doing it to make money. Like, there's other functions besides that. Like, if the Bitcoin price just never went up or down from here on out, like, it's still providing a function. Like, I don't know if he understands that. He's just assuming that everyone that buys crypto is an investor and must be protected now by the SEC. So is he saying that every crypto should be a security?
the question. I think if investors are being marketed these assets as an investment, being told, hey, if you buy this, if you give us your money, we'll do things with the money, and then you can profit from it.
But it depends too. Like, exchanges promote these coins, and they're not the founders of the tokens. They're not the founder of the coin, but the exchange, they want you to buy the coins and trade it with leverage, which is different than the founder saying, buy this coin and then, I'll do some work for you. If the founder says, this coin is awesome, and by next year we'll have this function enabled and we'll build this, and then next year after that we'll build this, like, that's definitely a security under the Howey test. They're telling you they're going to do work.
That seems like a security, and I think that has to inform the discussion. I went yesterday to look at the websites of some large broker dealers, and on the webpage of a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, there's always a tab about products that they offer, and in a lot of cases they say stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, crypto. I struggle with the idea that only 4 out of 5 are securities and not all 5. But even if you disagree, I worry that investors would be confused, right? Can it really give mutual funds? In a lot of cases, they say stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, crypto. I struggle with the idea that only 4 out of 5 are securities and not all 5. But
This guy just, he's saying, whether it's a security or not, but then he's saying crypto. He's struggling to accept that crypto is not a security. It's like, yeah, not every crypto is a security.
even if you disagree, I worry that investors would be confused, right? Can it really be the case that they're going to understand, even if you envision a world where all crypto assets are deemed to not be securities? Are they going to understand that, or are they going to not understand that and be put at risk as a result? And so I think that that question of how can you best protect investors and how are these products being marketed to investors is really fundamental.
Can I just jump in only because I've heard.
What does he work for? He works for Baker's Hostel, whatever. Baker Hostetler. No, that's Teresa. This guy works for Director of Securities Policy, Better Markets. He works for Better Markets, related to securities policy. Okay, so he wants security regulation clarity, right?
Can I just jump in only because I've heard the Chris view just mentioned a couple of times, one of the occupational hazards of going first. I did want to just for clarity, when I was starting, and maybe this is helpful for the conversation or maybe it's not. Ultimately, the question was framed for, well, what do you sort of think about the optimal sort of elements of a crypto regime? And to reiterate what we've already heard, there are different objectives. There's investor protection, and capital formation is also very important. And by the way, capital formation itself creates all kinds of interesting questions as to the regulatory perimeter. But once you do fall in that perimeter, the commission does have plenty of rulemaking authority. It happens all the time. I mean, courts make decisions, commissions then go about and they craft rules in response. They have exemptive authority, even with regards to primary legislation. The risk element was, you have to have a starting point for saying, okay, well, why are we involved in the first place? And then you have to take the secondary step of identifying, well, what's the appropriate regulatory response? If there isn't any, and this is, I guess, to echoing different folks at different times, but caveat emptor is not a regulatory strategy, and that's what we've had, and then you end up, complicating efforts to both protect investors and also to promote capital formation, and that's a challenge. I said my piece. All right, thanks.
Great, thanks, Chris. Rodrigo. So you've been at a fund, now you're practicing. From your perspective, having had the chance to hear what's been said as well as just your experience, is there one thing in particular that you think the commission could or should do, or at least could or should consider doing?
Thank you, and I'm Rodrigo Seda, Special Counsel at Cooley. So maybe I'll try to respond to some of the earlier comments and get to the conclusion of what I think they could do. I think it's key first to understand that just because there's investment intent behind a purchase doesn't turn that transaction automatically into security.
Yes.
I think that's a logical fallacy and something that would basically mean that securities law would eat the world and not one where I want to live in, right? So I think we have to be careful about the way that we shape this regime, understanding that we need to protect the capital markets and make sure that we don't create any loopholes, but also make sure that we're developing a framework that doesn't end up, again, consuming the world. I, for example, was talking yesterday over dinner about how I like to purchase art. Last week I was in New York. I purchased a piece from a young artist, partly because I liked it, I thought it was cool, but also it was somewhat of a bet that he would keep working, and he had a couple of shows lined up that I thought were interesting. I don't think that means that that transaction all of a sudden should be regulated as a securities transaction, right? I think I want to push back a little bit on this idea that the case law has been clear when applied to crypto, right? I think it's important to distinguish between the couple of waves of enforcement that the SEC brought. The first wave was really centered around ICOs and fraud. And it was mostly against defendants that didn't have the money or the incentive to fight a SEC enforcement. So a lot of those ended up in settlements, right? And I think from some of those we can take the premise that when you're selling crypto assets in a fundraising transaction, that fundraising transaction should be regulated by securities. And I think most of us on this panel would agree on that, right? I think the second wave of enforcement that focused more on intermediaries and brought pure registration violations, and it also targeted as defendants companies that had the resources and incentive to fight about the company litigation, resulted in a much more mixed bag of results, right? I don't think the SEC itself was clear in those cases about what it actually considered to be a security. The judge, in the Binance opinion, kind of chastised the staff about this, where they had flip-flopped between what exactly was the investment contract. And then I think we can't look over the fact that there was a split even in the same district court over how we extended to secondary transactions when you look at Ripple and you look at the Terra opinion.
Yeah, if we could just not talk about any specific cases, that'd be great.
Sorry, apologies for that. Anyways, I don't think it's true to say that the law is clear. And from the practitioner's perspective, I can tell you that I don't know what the law is. You have to somewhat try to advise people from general principles here, right? I think it's also important to understand that the current regulatory framework, the securities regulatory framework that is premised on registration and disclosure, is not fit for purpose for all crypto instruments. Well, it might apply for fundraising transactions. I think if we just fit crypto, if we jam it into securities, we're going to end up deprecating a lot of its unique qualities, right? crypto, at least for me, the reason I got into this space was because I saw it as a technology that enabled a new form of human collaboration, right? It allows people to come together in a digitally native way and collaborate over open source and public goods in a way that wasn't possible before. And it
Yeah, because code is speech. Blockchain is code. You can write an immutable message, a text message that cannot be changed, that will be there as long as the blockchain is there. And that has nothing to do with the value of a token or the price going up or down or anything like that. So I agree. Rodrigo, I think we're in line on a lot of things. That you can't just label everything as a security because it's an investment. Like, there's lots of things that are investments that aren't securities. Physical gold, and now Bitcoin. But the Bitcoin ETF, that is a security. But the ETF is not the real thing. It's not like holding physical gold.
gives people technological rights within a system that I think are, or I guess I should say technological powers within a system that I think are different from legal rights. So I don't think that just forcing the registration and disclosure regime onto these systems is going to really address the policy goals. And if you follow the downstream effects of doing that, I think it actually really handicaps the development of crypto in the United States. Yeah, and I guess finally, to kind of respond to the idea that, like, the SEC has predetermined that certain actions or that certain tokens are not securities, or they've, there's some whiplash here. I think to me that is an attempt to regulate with, humility and a sense of responsibility that is very important, and it comes from the premise.
Yeah, because ultimately, like, it's not up, in a way, the SEC is expected to know and be humble enough to say that, okay, this is not a security, we're going to leave it alone. But as we've seen, there's been overreach. A higher power in the government, what would it be? Congress, that says, hey, that's not a security. You cannot do what you're doing. You're affecting markets. You're manipulating markets by raising cases against coins and founders that aren't securities, and they should be held liable.
Of, like, we're all here with varying points of disagreement. It's required of a regulator when they're doing their job to, I think, first clarify these points of disagreements before you take somebody to court and try to figure it out there, right? So I actually commend the SEC on their new approach of, like, engaging with industry.
Yes.
And I think, frankly, needs to be a lot of work done to rebuild those channels of communication and trust between industry and regulators that I think are ultimately going to leave everybody off in a better place.
This is why I'm optimistic about the crypto industry, because we're going to have more sense and reason in the government now in regards to what's gonna happen.
Great. Thank you, Rodrigo. So, Louis, so you've written a lot on Howey as applied to crypto, and as I understand it, one of the distinctions you've drawn often in your writing is an investment contract, if it exists, from the token or a token or a crypto asset. Can you explain more conceptually that distinction, and beyond conceptually that distinction, practically how does one identify when that distinction actually exists?
Sure. Thank you, Troy, and thank you, Commissioner Peirce, and to the whole SEC staff for, I just second Rodrigo's thoughts of the importance of just our being in this room today. It's really a miracle, and to be honored to be on a podium with such great scholars. Yeah, so one of the things that comes from reading, an inordinate number of Howey cases, more or less all of them, is, patterns do develop. And one of the things I wrote a lot about is really where do we locate the idea of investment contract, even predating Howey, as we all know, comes from state law, and it's redressing an issue. Sometimes people couch what purport to be commercial transactions or arrangement. Hey, would you like to buy, a chinchilla, for example? Got a farm, you could have some of them. And people know you don't really want the chinchillas. What you want is to experience the business that person is running. And so you fund them and they pool that capital, and you've got some sort of ineluctable modality of chinchillas there. Those transactions, courts over the years have struggled with. Sometimes the SEC has won, sometimes they've lost, sometimes private plaintiffs have won and lost, but they've looked at the fundraising and the pooling of capital and the relationship, which with all respect, Miles, I wouldn't call formalistic at all, the relationship between the parties. And they found that in some cases, notwithstanding the parties couching a transaction, a fundraising as commercial, hey, would you like some of whatever it is that I've got? Really what the economic reality was is that people were seeking to invest. What the Howey case law has just really never addressed is what happens if you could create an investable asset that people could buy and sell and trade very easily. And that's just outside the scope of Howey. I wouldn't say it's in or out. So we have to think about how to apply that. And really what we're talking about here is not seeking to use the securities laws to punish people, but rather seeking to use the securities laws for their intended purpose, to address transactions in the marketplace. And when Bob and Alice, transact in ETH or they transact in some other token, those secondary transactions, those market participants need to be able to determine on their own, without consulting high-priced lawyers, without reading code, without studying the current state of a multisig, they need to figure out, hey, am I engaged in a securities transaction or am I not? If you could simply look at a token and say, oh, I see, there you go, that would be one thing. But if we create a construct in which every time any market participant needs to decide, am I engaged in a regulated activity, they have to make a time-consuming, expensive conclusion, then that really is very, very problematic from a market efficiency point of view. So the distinction is, when do I have something that is an instrument that no matter how it is dealt with, and I think Collins, I'm glad you brought up Section 12G because it's a good example. You have to know, is this something that's going to trigger 12G as a broker-dealer? Am I custodying a security or customer funds, or am I not? There are many places where you need to know, is this thing sitting there by itself a security or not? And that's an important distinction that our securities laws need to recognize. Now, maybe we'll be better off with something that Congress decides, here's a new framework, and here's how you think about crypto assets in the round, whether or not they're securities. And I think something could be said for that. But for right now, at least, we need to be able to make those distinctions so that market participants know when they're dealing with it. The people selling and fundraising, in most cases, can figure this out. And they're the ones that, in my view, should have that duty to figure out. They also have disclosure obligations. I think really, Troy, that what has been the greatest point of consternation here is because there hasn't been a pathway to properly sell these assets to the public, what we have are assets being sold in private transactions with little or no disclosure and then publicly traded, and a real absence of what the securities laws really are trying to address. And personally, I hope we can find a way out of that that problem.
Sure. Just to add, and I won't say I necessarily disagree with Lewis in the sense that I'm not sure, maybe if everybody's read his paper, there's maybe a sense that there should be a potential blanket, let's say, exclusion on secondary transactions. I don't take a position on that, but I do think historically our laws, and both the federal and state laws, have taken a position as to delineating the securities and the transaction itself. I think obviously we have Section 3 exempt securities and then Section 4 exempt transactions at the federal level. But then at every single state level, I think somebody said there are state regulators here, so they can obviously confirm. But at every single state level, we distinguish between exempt securities, usually in the prior section, and the transaction itself. So I think the past century of both legislative and rulemaking and jurisprudence does acknowledge that there are times where the transaction itself is obviously the focus of our inquiry, and then there are times that the asset itself is the focus of our inquiry. Sometimes those things may be one and the same. I think in particular for crypto, it's probably difficult to get to a place, at least from my end, where every single crypto asset would not be a security if it was only in a secondary transaction. And at the same time, there are probably some crypto assets that even if they weren't sold in exempt transactions, would inherently have properties that would make them securities. But I think that distinction should definitely not be one that seems to be somewhat controversial in some circles, because we've had that framework for almost a century now. So.
Great, Collins. Thank you for that. Lee, moving on to you, and then that's going to leave Coy, and then we're going to.
So far, I think it's pretty good. Like the other guy said, you know, everyone's has a little bit of disagreement here and there on different sort of arguments that they have. But they're trying to say, okay, let's really figure out what's security and
Lee,
what's not.
What's your take? My sense is that your view, and again, correct me if I'm wrong as I try to summarize, is that the question has, to some extent, as to what's a security in the context of crypto, maybe more than just to some extent, has been asked and answered by the Supreme Court and by the courts over the years. Is that a fair summation? And how do you think about the following aspect of it, going back to various things we've heard, which is you take the four prongs of Howey, for example, or even a principles-based approach. There's still then, you know, the practical question as to, but how does it get applied to any specific set of facts and circumstances? So that kind of translation of a four-part test or set of principles to actually being applied to concrete real-world facts and circumstances and some of the tough judgment calls. How does consideration of that, if it does, factor in terms of your take as to what constitutes a security when it comes to crypto, and if there's anything for the commission to do to provide additional clarity or to rethink the approach?
Sure. Thank you, Troy, and thank you, Commissioner Peirce, for hosting us and the staff for putting this together. I know from experience that events like this take a lot of effort, so certainly appreciate it. So I'm Lee Reiners. I'm from Duke University, and let the record show that we tipped off about 10 minutes ago. So go Duke. Let me also note that there's quite a bit of distance here between my fellow crypto skeptics, so feeling a little isolated up here. But you know, let me just start off with a note of agreement on some of the things we've discussed, and obviously we're here to start with as we.
Was he saying that there's crypto skeptics here, or that that Lee is a skeptic?
You said that the top of the funnel, you know, when is a crypto asset a security or not? But then I think, you know, sort of once that is decided, and I think it's pretty clear, and I agree with John, that courts, not just in SEC enforcement cases, but in private litigation, and state enforcement actions. And let's not forget, you know, the states have been you know, the earliest on the scene when it comes to crypto. You know, but after that, I think it is pretty clear, in my opinion at least, that some of the existing rules are not necessarily fit for purpose, and I think disclosure is exactly one of them. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that the information an investor in a crypto asset would want is just fundamentally different than the information an investor in, you know, Apple stock would want. I don't see how that's controversial, and obviously there's been custom disclosure frameworks provided in other contexts, you know, asset-backed securities, and so this is something that Chair Ueda has suggested, and I would certainly be open to. You know, another issue, of course, is, well, should a broker-dealer be able to offer you know, securities alongside you know, crypto assets that are probably commodities, right? And I frankly don't see the issue with that, provided, you know, certain risk controls are in place, and, you know, that's perhaps an opportunity for the commission to use its exemptive authority, as others have suggested. So I put all that out there to know that I'm not necessarily disagreeing with my fellow panelists on every single issue, but look, you know, the Howey test is a flexible standard, And I have to disagree with Rodrigo's disagreement with John. In over hundreds of cases, right? Judges have applied Howey's 3 or 4 prongs, depending on your perspective, to the offering of digital asset transactions and found, in fact, there was a presence of an investment contract. I think, look, one issue that Lewis raised and I put in my statement is this notion of what I call the separation theory, and as Lewis pointed out earlier, perhaps I should have called it the embodiment theory, and this was raised in a ruling that Rodrigo referenced, but I will not reference it because I will follow the rules. In which case, sorry to throw you under the bus, Rodrigo, in which a judge, pointed out that the subject of an investment contract is separate or different from the investment contract itself, right? So, Citrus Groves itself were not an investment contract, right? But when packaged with Howey's promise to manage those and distribute profits, then the whole sort of scheme became an investment contract. And so I kind of grappled with this in my statement. And where I
So
came
it's
up
how
with,
you use it that it becomes an investment contract, which is regulated by the SEC. So like Bitcoin in itself is not a security, but when you repackage it as an ETF, for an example, then it is. I don't know. The repackaging is someone else managing it, and you hope that it's actually backed. Like there's a futures ETF and there's a spot ETF. Spot ETF should be regulated to be actually and always backed by the real asset, which is Bitcoin. The futures ETF, obviously it's different. How do I describe it? Well, let's see what Lee says. Someone who's like way more versed in the subject of securities law than I am.
with is that there's a fundamental difference here between the subject of a security scheme and the security instrument itself, and that difference is the means of participation. So no one received Howey's promise earnings distributions by simply buying the orange groves, right? On the contrary, a token issuer promises profits by impacting the price of the token. Therefore, all the purchasers of the token receive profit through the issuer's efforts. And because tokens are fungible, it's impossible for the issuer's promise of profits to be paired with some tokens and not all tokens. So whereas the fortunes of 99.99% a promise of purchasers of the token receive profit tracking the price of the token, therefore all the purchasers of the token receive profit through the issuer's efforts. And because tokens are fungible, it's impossible for the issuer's promise of profits to be paired with some tokens and not all tokens. So whereas the fortunes of 99.99% of Orange Grove owners have no relation at all to Howey, the fortunes of all token holders are dependent on the token issuer. So therefore, I think it's pretty clear the token is not merely the subject of the scheme. It is the security instrument itself. And I think if some of these cases been allowed to proceed, I think that's certainly where courts would have come out. So again, I think Howey's flexible. It's facts and circumstances dependent. Another thing that's sort of come up is sort of the role of decentralization. We would probably all agree, I'm guessing, that Bitcoin is not a security, it's not an investment contract because it is sufficiently decentralized. There are no, there's no common enterprise. There's no others to point to receive your expected profit. So of course that raises the question then is, can we draw a line where something is sufficiently decentralized to no longer be considered an investment contract? And I just think that's an impossible line to draw. And I would point folks to the CFTC's report that came out in 2014, or 2024, I'm sorry, is a report from the Technology Advisory Committee on DeFi. And the members of this committee that put together that report were mostly worked in the crypto industry, including at DeFi firms. And they noted that decentralization exists along a spectrum across multiple dimensions. So you have governance, asset, user, application, data, network, protocol, hardware. So how do you determine when these dimensions are sufficiently decentralized enough to ensure profits don't come from the efforts of others? I just think, again, that is a completely futile task for any agency to try to attempt. Even if you do attempt it and you suggest, okay, we think in these conditions it's not an investment contract, it's not a security, well then it may be a commodity, and you might have the CFTC making a ruling that you don't necessarily agree with, right? So finding that DAO governance token holders who vote their governance tokens can be held jointly and severally liable for the actions of the DAO. And so this is why I think it's best to just leave it to the courts and have it be facts and circumstances dependent, because otherwise you're just never going to get to, I know we all want to get to this sort of promised land of clarity.
Oh yeah, that's what I said earlier. Like, let the court decide, especially. But I mean, the SEC is what started these cases against founders and against coins. So is Lee saying that the SEC should no longer consider something a security and not file lawsuits? Or that they should keep doing that because then the court can decide if they're right or not? How do you let the courts decide if nobody sues the founder? Even if unjustly, the court unjustly sues the founder of a coin, which is really not a security because it is essentially sufficiently decentralized.
And I just, again, I don't think you'll be able to do it. And my final point is, look, whatever outcome of this task force, and perhaps there's sort of a new guidance in terms of how the SEC is going to apply or interpret Howey to digital assets going forward, that doesn't mean that courts have to follow it, right? And to the extent that SEC is no longer going to be an effective cop on the beat when it comes to crypto, that void is going to be filled by private plaintiffs, okay, who are going to perhaps have a different interpretation of Howey. And in fact, we have seen numerous cases in which courts have agreed with plaintiffs across, not just digital assets, ICOs, but even NFTs, that they found to meet the definition of an investment contract. States are not going to stop either. So while the purpose and intent may be to provide regulatory clarity, the effect may actually end up being the opposite. And that, I just want to end on that sort of note of caution to those who are doing this great work.
Great, thanks, thanks, Lee. And then Coy, to you. So
best for last.
Yeah. And then if there's stuff folks want to, sorry.
Not sure if I have enough battery
to
get through the next speaker.
Attention. Teresa already has, and I got.
So I'll pause it
I
here.
got a question or two.
And I'll do a part 2 later on. Cheers, everybody. Yeah, I really liked the discussion of DeFi because that's what it's all really about. And the more decentralized it is, the more you can really put it under this umbrella of a DeFi application, a DeFi protocol. And that's what I'm really excited about as a technician working in IT, working in networks, working in data centers, working to fix software and network issues. I really like this idea of the decentralized network, and I think it's going to get better and better, and it's going to be fun. So with that, yeah, I'll end the stream and come back with part 2. We'll finish it up later.